Okay, so we are getting going here, and good afternoon. We're going back to 1975, and a whole bunch of things took place in 1975. Some women said you're worried about your son and Vietnam. Well, Vietnam, the war had been over, but Americans were still in South Vietnam in 1975. They left in 1975. Gerald Ford survived two assassination attempts. You might remember this headline from the Daily News: Ford to city, drop dead. Remember New York had a financial crisis? I gave this talk the other day, and there was a guy who was a teacher who told me that he somehow hung on to his job, but a lot of people lost their job because the city was running out of money. Henry Kissinger, who recently celebrated his 100th birthday, is doing the shuttle diplomacy. Henry Kissinger is still alive. He just celebrated his 100th birthday a few days ago, so he is still alive. The Spanish dictator, Francisco Franco, died, and he became a part of a long-running joke on the original cast of Saturday Night Live when it came out in 1975, that he's still dead. World War II officially came to an end 30 years after it came to an end with the Helsinki Accords. The guy, this is the Soyuz astronauts, the Americans. I met two astronauts in my life, Thomas Stafford and Buzz Aldrin. One was a general, and one was Buzz Aldrin, who was crazy. And I'll tell you a bit more about him in a little while. How many of you use computers? And how many of you use Microsoft? Well, Microsoft was founded 48 years ago on April 4th. And how many of you were transfixed by what was going on with Patty Hearst? How many of you watched the saga of Patty Hearst? That was, that was reality TV, right? Anyway, she's arrested. And this guy, Jimmy Hoffa, disappears. Remember Jimmy Hoffa? Yeah, he disappeared, never to be seen again.
Nice picture.
Margaret Thatcher, wearing that sweater, becomes the head of the Conservative Party in England. And how many of you were frightened by Jaws? How many of you saw the movie Jaws? It was only a movie. It was only a movie. Family Viewing Hour, which impacted this show. How many of you watched All in the Family? You know, you couldn't do All in the Family these days because it was not politically correct, all the things that they did. There were a lot of names that were called which are considered not nice these days. The last of the Ali Frazier greatness is the fight between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier in the Philippines. And disco, how many of you danced under that ball? How many of you went to the disco? Nobody wants to admit going to a disco? Nobody went to Studio 54 in those places?
We're not old enough.
Not old enough. Bruce Springsteen put out his first big album, Born to Run, and it's time to say goodbye. Goodbye to South Vietnam for the United States. The war in Vietnam comes to an end in April of 1975. A series of events leads to the fall of Saigon. North Vietnamese army began an aggressive campaign against South Vietnam in April. North Vietnam took Saigon. After realizing that it would be impossible to defend the South against North Vietnam, the South Vietnamese President Kim resigned. South Vietnam surrendered unconditionally to the North, and that ended about 20 years of U.S. involvement in South Vietnam. The United States under Dwight Eisenhower began sending advisors to South Vietnam in 1955 to prop up the Diem government. South Vietnam would fall in 1973. The war officially, excuse me?
Was there actually, are you fighting it all that time?
Yeah, there were people getting
20
killed.
years?
There were people getting killed in the 50s and 60s prior to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in 1964, which Lyndon Johnson requested troops go into Vietnam, South Vietnam. So the United States involvement in the war ends on April 30th, after 2 decades, as the last military members escaped in helicopters taking off from the embassy in Saigon. Why were the Americans in South Vietnam? And I think one of you said that you had a child around this time that you were worried about him ending up in South Vietnam. Well, if you know anything about history, they tried to push something called the domino theory at you. And that was the Eisenhower people along with the Dulles people. And basically they said, look, China fell in 1949 to communism. North Korea fell to communism in 1950, North Vietnam 1954. Laos would go, and Cambodia would go, and Thailand would go, and Malaysia would go, Indonesia would go, and Burma would go, and India would go, Australia would go, New Zealand, Canada. The world would be all communist. All communist. Well, the communist takeover of Vietnam did happen in 1975. South Vietnam by the Viet Cong. Laos, the neighboring country Laos, by the Pathet Lao. And also Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. By the way, how many of you remember Kent State in 1970?
Oh.
Yeah, remember Kent State? Why was the protest at Kent State? Because the United States started bombing Cambodia, and students demonstrated. And that's 53 years ago. You know, those students now are about anywhere between 71 and 75 years old. Anyway, they were protesting against the bombing of Cambodia. The Pathet Lao overthrew the royalist government in Laos, forcing the king, Vat Naha, to abdicate on December 2nd, and despite a massive American bombing campaign against them, the Khmer Rouge won the Cambodian Civil War when they captured the Cambodian capital and overthrew the Khmer Republic in 75. That is Louette Squeaky Phram. That is not one of the seven dwarfs. Although she looks like a seven dwarf, doesn't she? She looks like one of them. Well, her buddy was Charles Manson, and Gerald Ford is her target in an assassination attempt. There were two assassination attempts on Gerald Ford. September 5th, assassination attempt number 1. Gerald Ford's in Sacramento, one-day visit to the California Capitol. And he's going, and he did have a breakfast speech, and then he met with the governor of the state, Jerry Brown. By the way, Jerry Brown was dating Linda Ronstadt around this time. Remember Governor Moonbeam and Linda Ronstadt? Well, he was dating her at that time. And then he's giving a speech to the California legislature. Lynette Squeaky Phram confronted Ford in Sacramento's Capitol Park. She's dressed in a red robe, she's armed with a gun, and she is protesting the treatment of the California redwoods and figures that she'd get all the attention she needs by assassinating Gerald Ford. And there she is. She's been subdued after her attempt to assassinate Ford. Secret Service agent wrestled a semi-automatic .45 caliber pistol from Phram, who brandished the weapon during a Ford public appearance. Phram was a follower of the incarcerated cult leader Charles Manson, and she pointed the loaded gun at the president when the Secret Service agent grabbed it. Any Beach Boys fans here? Anybody likes the Beach Boys? Yeah, well, the Beach Boys did Good Vibrations. They did a whole bunch of other songs as well. Well, anyway, Charles Manson was friendly with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. And on one of the Beach Boys songs, Charles Manson is credited as a co-writer. His group killed Sharon Tate, but Sharon Tate wasn't the object of their ire. What Charles Manson wanted to do was kill Doris Day's son, Terry Melcher, because he was a record producer and didn't think Charles Manson had any kind of musical ability. So Charles Manson sent his group to the last known address of Terry Melcher. He wasn't there anymore. Sharon Tate was. They killed Sharon Tate. She wasn't involved, Squeaky Phram, but she liked Charles Manson. She was restrained. The pistol had been loaded with 4 rounds, but there wasn't a round in the chamber, and the gun did not go off. And there's Charles Manson. I'm not sure he was the mastermind of the first assassination attempt. He's already in jail at this point. Phram pleaded not guilty to attempted assassination of president charge. Although she said that, listen, my gun, yeah, it had bullets, but it hadn't been cocked, and so I really didn't intend to shoot the president. She was convicted, sentenced to life in prison, sent to Alderson Federal Correction Institute in West Virginia. She was released on parole August of 2009. She served 34 years. She's on TV in 2019, 10 years later, 44 years after the incident, and she's asking in an interview about Charles Manson. Well, were you in love with Charles Manson? Her answer was I in love with Charlie? Yeah, I still am. The second assassination attempt was also in California, this time San Francisco, and it's about 2.5 weeks later, September 22nd. Gerald Ford emerged from San Francisco's Union Square Hotel Post Street entrance, 3:30 in the afternoon, after addressing a World Affairs Council audience. He paused before getting into his limousine to wave at the crowd across the street, and 2 shots rang out. The first narrowly missed the 38th President of the United States. The second was deflected by a bystander who grabbed the arm of the shooter, who's a 45-year-old middle-class housewife who was a dabbler in extreme politics. And she was also an FBI informant by the name of Sarah Jane Moore. So she had a lot of things going for her, and there she is, Sarah Jane Moore. She was paroled in 2007. She served 32 years behind bars. 2009, she told NBC's Today Show program, it was a time people don't remember. I know you remember it because you mentioned your son was Vietnam going on at the time. So we're in 2023, and this is 14 years earlier. So she said it was a time people don't remember. You know, we had a war, Vietnam War. I became immersed in it. We were saying that the country needed to change. The only way it was going to change was a violent revolution. I genuinely thought that shooting Ford might trigger that new revolution in this country. Now, Gerald Ford looked at these 2 people as nut jobs, and he talked about that in 2004. He talked about his 2 would-be assassins. I guess these people who do attempt assassinations are unusual. Squeaky Fromm certainly was off her mind. Sarah Jane Moore, the same way. It's Abe Beame. Remember Abe Beame, mayor of New York? Anybody live in New York City around 1974, 75, 76? Or you were all in the summer? You were in New York City?
Yeah.
Where?
Where did I live?
Yeah.
Central Park West.
Central Park West. So you know all about this.
Oh, yeah.
You know all about
The
this.
East Side shouldn't have Gracie Mansion.
Yeah. Well, you must have seen Abe Beame once in a while. He's a diminutive man. He actually, my wife was on Broadway in Kismet, and he was there opening night in the first row. And I said, were you able to see him because he's that big? She said, yeah, I saw him. Anyway, Abe Beame, he's carrying a famous newspaper. This is one of the most famous newspaper headlines ever in the history of United States newspapers. Basically, it says this: Ford to city, drop dead. Okay. Well, you would know this. New York City's finances were under stress as the city tried to maintain its extensive local welfare state despite the pressures of the recession of the early 1970s and the underlying economic problems. It faced industrial decline, and it also had middle-class flight, white flight. On October 17, 1975, New York City almost went bankrupt. The city tried to borrow money to covering a widening budget gap. By 1975, major banks refused to market its debt. The New York City mayor, Abraham Beame, and the governor, Hugh Carey, who I got to interview in 1978, and he's one of the reasons why I ended up on WNEW radio in 1978 as a 21-year-old. Many of you listened to WNEW radio. William B. Williams back in the day? Make Believe Ballroom? Yeah, you remember it. I was 21 years old. I was working for them. Thanks to John Lindsay. He told me he was running for Senate in 1980. It was March of 1978.
John Lindsay.
I interviewed him, and they told me he's running for Senate. It was the biggest story in New York in March of 1978 on whatever Saturday it was. And WNEW wanted the story. They called me up. They said, we want that story from you. I said, how much are you going to pay me? They said, $10. I said, sold. And that's how I started working at WNEW as a 21-year-old because of an interview with John Lindsay, and 21-year-olds will never get that opportunity again in radio. That was absolute luck, and radio has gone downhill since then. But anyway, so Hugh Carey was at this place, and Patrick Moynihan, and Mario Cuomo, and I interviewed Lindsay, and I didn't need to interview Cuomo that day, or Carey that day, and that's how my career started with WNEW. But they pointed out that alien corporations were getting government handouts. So why shouldn't New York, or why should New Yorkers be made to suffer for problems that were the result of economic forces beyond the city's control? And there is Hugh Carey, the governor, who went before Congress begging for money, begging, bail out New York. You have to bail out New York. Well, Ford and his advisors, including people that you've probably heard, Donald Rumsfeld and Ellen Greenspan, who end up marrying Andrea Mitchell on NBC. And Andrea Mitchell should not be covering anything with the federal government, as her husband at one point was the chairman of the feds. But NBC doesn't care about conflicts. They insisted, hey, the city's problem, they're their city's problem. It's not our problem. New York's default would not have a significant economic impact. Greenspan, there's no shortcut to financial responsibility. He was the chairman of the economic advisors. He writes that in the memo. But there is a voice of reason who basically takes Gerald Ford and Donald Rumsfeld and Ellen Greenspan together and bangs their head together to get some sense into them. The guy who's the voice of reason is the guy to the right, your left, of Gerald Ford. His name is Helmut Schmidt, and he is the chairman, he is the chancellor of West Germany. And he basically tells these guys, look, you better help them out. Because you may think, it's a democratic city and you're Republicans, you may be playing those political games. I'm not here to play those political games. I'm here to tell you, you let New York City go bankrupt, you're looking at a worldwide depression. Well, Schmidt told Congress, American Congress, a New York default would have global repercussions. In the end, Ford said, okay, don't drop dead. I know I'm not going to win the city in the next election, but don't drop dead. It's okay. We'll give you some loans. But the city fired thousands of police officers, firefighters, teachers, and other public workers. Meanwhile, another chapter in the Middle East is taking place. This is the signing of accords between Egypt and Israel, and Henry Kissinger is down there in the corner. And finally, there is some breakthrough at this point after 27 years of fighting between Israel and Egypt and wars. The 48 War, the Suez Canal Crisis, 56-57, the Six-Day War in 67, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. 4 wars already. In March, Kissinger began another round of shuttle diplomacy aimed at disengagement in the Sinai. While Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was reluctant to cede any territory in the Sinai, Kissinger and Ford applied pressure on Israel by suspending arms deliveries. You want weaponry? Listen to us. And that's what they did. After meetings in Washington and in Israel, Rabin agreed to renew negotiations in August. Their agreement, signed on September 4th, included Israeli withdrawal from the oil fields and Mitla and the Gida passes, as well as the creation of a UN-monitored buffer zone. But don't invite the PLO. We don't want anything to do with the Palestine Liberation Organization, according to Henry Kissinger. Got a little story here. A friend of mine, a guy by the name of Bob Friedman, Robert Owen Friedman. He's written books about the Middle East. He went into the United States Army in 1965. I'm absolutely certain he was CIA. He also ended up being an advisor to Rabin and other Israeli prime ministers. He spoke with the PLO, and one day he's got to speak with Yasser Arafat. And that's in Tunis, Tunisia. And Friedman gets there, and Friedman's waiting and waiting and waiting, he told me the story. And he said that finally, after 3 hours, Arafat walks in. And he looks at Friedman, he says, "You're Friedman?" He said, yeah. The kosher food's over there. Go out, have something to eat, let's sit down and talk. He said, "No, before I want to sit down and talk, I don't like that speech you gave today to your people." He said, "Forget about it. I have to tell them something. They need something. Please, eat, and let's talk." And that's how Arafat was with him. Like, okay, sure, I made that talk, but don't pay any attention to what I said. Let's talk about what we really need to talk about. In pursuing Israel to sign the second disengagement agreement with Egypt, Kissinger promised not to negotiate with the PLO until it recognized Israel, accepted the legitimacy of the UN Security Council Resolution 242, and renounced the use of terrorism. Francisco Franco, Spain, the Spanish dictator, the fascist, became a running joke on NBC's Saturday Night Show, now called Saturday Night Live. Many of you remember the original Saturday Night with Chevy Chase. Actually, there were two Saturday nights that started in 1975. The Late Night Show on NBC, and one with Helen Cosell, who hosted Saturday Night on ABC TV, Saturdays at 8 o'clock. It was a terrible show. I knew Howard, knew him rather well, still friendly with three of his grandkids, Justin and Colin and Jared. Anyway, Francisco Franco dies. The dictatorial leader of Spain dies at the age of 82 in November, taking power as the head of Spanish state in 1939 after his nationalists defeated the Republic forces during the Spanish Civil War. Early in his regime, it was characterized by harsh political oppression, but as he aged, more progressive ideas and reforms were allowed. For instance, in 1961, in Spain, a law was passed that men and women doing the same job had to get the same pay. Ever happened in the United States? Not really. But the fascist dictator said, hey, women and men should be paid the same amount of money for the same job, regardless of experience. Also, at the Atria down in Roslyn Heights, I met a Holocaust victim who was saved by Francisco Franco. Now, Franco kept out of the war, but this is how she was saved. She got to Holland, and her ships docked in Spain, and they didn't stop her. They didn't turn her back. And an estimated 30 to 40,000 Jews were able to escape Europe because Francisco Franco looked the other way. I bet you didn't know that. It's the first time I ever met somebody who was saved by Franco. And Franco was no friend of Israel. At least I don't think so. He was against, well, he could do what he wanted. He was a dictator. He was against the Israeli state being formed. Yet he undid the 1492 Inquisition and told Jews to come back to Spain. Go figure. Well, that was part of Franco. During World War II, he aligned with the Axis powers of Italy and Germany and Japan, but the country was kept out of the conflict. After his death, the monarchy was restored. King Juan Carlos took power as per Franco's instructions, and democracy was established soon after his death. Chevy Chase. You know who Chevy Chase is, right? I'm Chevy Chase, and you're not. He was on NBC's Saturday Night, which became Saturday Night Live, and the running joke was Francisco Franco is still dead. Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. Catchphrase that originated in 1975 during the first season of NBC's Saturday Night, which mocked the weeks-long media reports of the impending death of Francisco Franco. Saturday Night, now known as SNL or Saturday Night Live, premiered on October 11th, 1975. Well, World War II kind of ends in 1975, except there's one little piece of World War II that has never been settled. the Soviet Union, now Russia and Japan, have never signed a peace agreement. And they're fighting over a bunch of islands near both countries. And it's still being contested. So technically, World War II has never ended. I bet you didn't know that. Well, it really hasn't ended. But there's Leonid Brezhnev and there's Gerald Ford. Hey, Brezhnev looks happy. Most times you see a picture of him, he's not happy. The United States, Canada, Europe, and the Soviet Union met to sign the Helsinki Accords, setting forth rules of international conflict, including human rights. The accords were an effort to tamp down tensions between the Soviets and the West by affirming post-World War II borders and fostering cooperation on arms control, science, trade, and other issues. Western nations secured a Soviet commitment to both nuclear de-escalation and a series of foundational human rights precepts. These included freedom of movement, freedom of ideas, conformity with the 1948 United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which declared freedom of expression, religion, and association to be universal rights. This guy right here, I interviewed him. His name is Thomas Stafford, General Thomas Stafford. Did one interview with him. Button-down general, didn't have much to say. I've met two astronauts in my life. He's one of them. The other one was Buzz Aldrin, who was the second guy to walk on the moon. Buzz Aldrin had a little bit of a temper. One day he's addressing people and some guy said, "You never walked on the moon. It was all faked. It was done in a Hollywood studio." Aldrin, who was probably 60 years old at the time, ran over to him and punched him out. Buzz Aldrin. Anyway, the United States-Soviet Union space flight, it's July of 1975. The object was to dock a U.S. Apollo module with the Soviet Soyuz 19. This was the final space flight of the Apollo module, a program that ended in 1972. Oh, the Apollo moon program ended in 72. In 1970, Richard Nixon cut funding to NASA, which is the agency responsible for spaceflight. And one of the reasons that he cut funding was the second Apollo mission to land on the moon, Apollo 12. TV ratings fell. That's how they judged it. The TV ratings fell, so we don't have to fund you because the TV ratings fell. The two spacecraft were launched on the same day. The Soyuz mission returned to Earth 6 days after being in space. The Apollo mission returned to Earth after 9 days. The docking was considered successful. The two crews performed several experiments together. It was the first of many successful collaborations between the Americans and the Russians in space. And there seemed to be a softening of the relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at that time. Meanwhile, Great Britain, well, they joined the Economic Union in 1973, but they wanted voters to say yes in 1975. So, in the United Kingdom, the first ever national referendum over whether the UK should remain in the European Economic Community, Britain said, or the voters said, yeah, it's fine, on June 5th. And the question they were asked was, do you think the UK should stay in the economic community, the common market? Every administration, county, and region in the UK returned majority yes votes. This was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union by proxy. The Angolan Civil War, which started after Portugal gave up the country, the colony. The war began immediately after Angola became independent from Portugal in November. The war was a power struggle between two former anti-colony guerrilla movements, the Communist People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola and the Anti-Communist National Union for the total independence of Angola. And Cuba sent troops there, and the United States and the Soviets were part of it without really being part of the fighting. Doesn't Bill Gates look like a teenager? Take a look at him. Right above the Microsoft sign, that is Bill Gates. And that is Paul Allen, who looks like he escaped from San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury. And they form a company by the name of Microsoft. And almost nobody realizes or even is aware of the fact that this company starts on April 4th. Bill Gates, Paul Allen, they start the company, originally called Microsoft, for microprocessors and software, in order to produce software for the Altair 8800 personal computer. You know how they tell you, parents tell your kids, don't drop out of Harvard, you'll never make it if you drop out of Harvard? Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. Think it hurt him? I don't think so. I don't think so. Meanwhile, Paul Allen quit his job as a programmer in Boston to focus on their new company, which they based in Albuquerque. I knew I should have made a left turn in Albuquerque. Bugs Bunny. The city was home to the electronics firm MITS, makers of the Altair 8800. The rest is history. So how many of you were glued before your televisions to watch Patty Hearst? How many of you remember Patty Hearst on TV? How many of you cared about Patty Hearst? There's a difference. Do you care about Patty Hearst, or did you watch it because it was good television? Ended up being good television. And in the television business, good TV sells. And people like good TV, even if it's bad TV, like watching Patty Hearst. But she had captured the nation in 1974, 1975's attention. The newspaper heirs, Patty Hearst, granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, who was a really bad guy, really, really bad guy, but that's besides the point, is found in a San Francisco apartment and is arrested for armed robbery of a bank in September. She'd been kidnapped in Berkeley, California on February 4th, 1974. In April of 74, she sent letters to the media stating she was joining the Symbionese Liberation Army of her own free will. Later that month, a surveillance camera took a photo of her participating in an armed robbery of a San Francisco bank, making her a wanted criminal by the FBI. Following her capture, she went on trial for her crimes. She was found guilty, sentenced to 7 years in prison. She served 2 years. Her sentence was commuted by Jimmy Carter, and she was later pardoned by Bill Clinton. Jimmy Hoffa. Oh, look at you. Would you trust a guy who looked like that? Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa. He's somewhere, or his bones are somewhere. Somewhere. Hoffa served as president of the powerful Teamsters Union from '57 until his imprisonment for conspiracy and fraud in the late 1960s. He goes missing in July, declared legally dead 7 years later. Goes to this restaurant, Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, the Red Fox restaurant. He would have been better off going to see a Red Fox concert or stand-up routine by Red Fox. Might have been still alive. He was Sanford and Son in those days, Red Fox. On July 30th, Hoffa left his Detroit area home for a meeting with a local crime figure and a mob-connected union leader from New Jersey at a restaurant in Bloomfield Township. The get-together was supposed to be about settling a feud, but Hoffa was the only one who showed up, and nobody knows what happened afterwards. Nobody. His car was found in the restaurant's parking lot, but there were no clues as to where he ended up. He was declared legally dead in 1982. And then there were the rumors that Jimmy Hoffa was buried in the end zone of Giant Stadium in the Meadowlands of East Rutherford, New Jersey, in that area where I'm standing on the field. Back in those days, wow, look what a sight I was. I had white pants and white shoes. That's like Pat Boone back in 1984, white shoes. But anyway, Jimmy Hoffa was not buried there. Where was he buried? Who knows? Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher becomes the most powerful woman in Britain. In England's Conservative Party circles, Margaret Thatcher stood little chance of defeating Edward Heath for the party leadership. She won. Her victory was considered a surprise by many. In 1979, the Conservative Party won the general election, and Thatcher became the prime minister. She replaced James Callaghan. Hey, I had hair once, but I was only 26 years old at this point. It's Watergate Hotel. I'm walking by the Watergate Hotel, and my new wife said to me, let's take a picture. She actually stayed at the Watergate. She actually performed at the Kennedy Arts Center. She was on Broadway as well and sung national anthems and all that stuff. On February 21st, John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman were sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for their role in the Watergate cover-up. The three were convicted by a federal jury on January 1st. They weren't playing any games. They met on New Year's Day of conspiring to obstruct justice, paying a nearly $500,000 in hush money to Watergate burglars and lying to investigators. 17 former aides to Richard M. Nixon, or employees of his re-election campaign, were convicted or pleaded guilty to charges in the Watergate break-in and the subsequent cover-up. That is an autograph of Richard Nixon that I got. You can't really see it well, but this is on a straight line. And I handed him an index card. I first met him in 1985. He was selected as the arbitrator of the 1985 dispute between Major League owners, Major League umpires, and it's a long story, but let me tell you about the autograph. Oh, whenever I would see him, I would say, Mr. President, to him, and he would say, no, please call me Dick. So I hand him this index card, and he puts it on the table, and he lines it up to the edge of the table. He takes out a little ruler, and on top of that little ruler, he signed his name, and then took the ruler away, put it back in his pocket with the X. Call me Dick. Dick Nixon, I got to call him Dick because, after all, right, he told me to call him Dick. He got a pardon in 1974 from Gerald Ford. There were money woes in the United States. The unemployment rate was 9.2%. The recession's recognized by President Ford. Britain's inflation rate is 25%. And the price of oil, $13 a barrel. How many of you saw this movie? Jaws. Were you scared by it? It's only a movie. It's only a movie, right? Jaws was released in 1975. It became one of the first blockbuster films. At the time of its release, it had become the highest grossing film of all time. The film was directed by Steven Spielberg, starred Richard Dreyfuss, Roy Schneider, and Robert Shore. And there they are. The plot revolved around a killer shark terrorizing a small town and those who would hunt it. It was nominated for several Academy Awards and won 3 of them. Known for its dramatic score by John Williams. I just recently was in the Berkshires last weekend, and John Williams is still playing Tanglewood every year. He's about 91 years old. He walks perfectly, and he conducts. He's at 91. No walker, nothing. He's conducting. Superior editing and suspenseful premise. The film Jaws is considered by many critics to be one of the greatest films of all time. But it was only a film. Steven Spielberg wouldn't put his body into a shark, would he? I wouldn't put my head into a shark, would I?
Yeah.
It's a movie, but that's Jaws. Boy, the way Glenn Miller played. Songs that made the hit parade. Family viewing hour. And basically it was the networks and the government saying you got to put family-friendly shows on at 8 o'clock Eastern time for an hour at 7 o'clock Central time. And they went after that show. Family viewing hour, policy established by the Federal Communications Commission in the United States. Under the policy, each television network in the U.S. had the responsibility to air family-friendly program during the first hour of the primetime lineup, 8 to 9 Eastern, 7 to 8 Central, 8 to 9 Pacific. This program is brought to you in living color on NBC, and here's the problem. 1974, there was one television scene that caused a particularly strong backlash. 1974 NBC TV movie called Born Innocent, which featured a lesbian rape scene. The scene drew much outcry upon its first airing and was blamed for the real-life rape of a young woman, which led the case to be heard before a California Supreme Court. January, FCC Chairman Richard E. Wiley addressed the Senate and House Communications Commerce subcommittees stating that all three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, agreed to adopt the family viewing hour in response to the criticism. The National Association of Broadcasters took the gesture one step further, decreeing that local stations also air family-friendly programming in the 7 p.m. time slot, time that the networks were forbidden from programming under the primetime access rule, and thus it's up to individual stations to program. Norman Lear, he's also 100 years old. He's also around at the age of 100, and is also speaking his mind at the age of 100. Still around. He had the show All in the Family. That was a top-rated show for years and years, since 1971, but was pushed into the Monday night 9 o'clock time slot, which was against ABC's Monday Night Football. And Norman Lear went nuts. He decided to sue, said, my creative freedom is being impinged upon and my First Amendment rights are not being upheld. So he sues, and he gets the support of varied guilds, including the Writers Guild. He won the case. The Constitution, we the people, the law was unconstitutional. November 4th, 1976, U.S. District Court Judge Warren J. Ferguson declared the family viewing hour unconstitutional. How many of you had a VHS? How many of you used to tape TV shows and watch TV? You never taped a TV show to watch later, back in the 80s? Never did? You never taped any TV shows? None of you?
No, I had one.
Yeah, you had one. Everybody had one. Yeah, everybody had one. So you could tape a show while you're out because you wanted to watch the show. Betamax and the VHS. Sonny introduces Betamax videotapes, and Matsushita JVC introduced the VHS. Sony released the Betamax video cassette recording system for sale in Japan. It would have cost you several $1,000s in those days, and other companies also began selling their own systems using a different format, video home system. The end of an era, and here I am, I'm interviewing Joe Frazier. It was Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali that transformed the sports pages and made it into mainstream media. Ali and Frazier met 3 times, twice in New York and one in the Philippines, the last one on September 30th, 1975. The first fight took place Madison Square Garden, March 8th, 1971. Ali lost to Frazier. Second fight, also Madison Square Garden, January 28th, 1974, Ali defeated Frazier. This is the last one, and that's Leroy Neiman's painting for the program of that fight, The Thriller in Manila. Ali pounded away in the latter rounds of the fight. Seeing the results of round 14, Frazier's trainer, Eddie Futch, decided to stop the fight between rounds rather than risk a similar or worse fate for Frazier in the 15th. Frazier protested the fight, shouting, "I want him, boss," trying to get Futch to change his mind. Futch said, "It's all over. No one will forget what you did here tonight," singled to the referee, Carlos Padilla Jr., to end the bout. Well, Ali was ready to give up. And this is my son, and this is Angelo Dundee. This is back in 1994. He was Muhammad Ali's trainer. He refused to allow Muhammad Ali to quit. Ali would later claim this was the closest he came to dying. Unbeknownst to Frazier's corner, at the end of the 14th round, Ali instructed his cornerman to cut off the gloves. But Ali's trainer, Angelo Dundee, ignored him. Ali later told his biographer, Thomas Hauser, "Frazier quit just before I did. I didn't think I could fight anymore." Padilla, who scored the fight, and ringside judges had Ali ahead by a comfortable margin on points, but many of the ringside press had the fight scored much closer. And there is me and Ali in 1985. Ali won the fight, the end of the era. It was claimed that the fight was watched by 1 billion people, 1 in every 6 people on earth. 100 million viewers watched the fight on closed-circuit theater television. In the United States, 500,000 pay-per-view buys on HBO, the home cable television network. Does anybody do The Hustle? Anybody do the hustle? Nobody did the hustle? You used to? I'm talking about you used to, back in the day. Back in the 70s, you did the hustle, the fly. Didn't do any of that? Nor did I. I was the one who sat in the corner talking. The guys who really did well were on the dance floor, dancing, because the women, and let me, it's all women here, right? It's not a man here. Do guys do better on the dance floor, or do women think guys are better because they know how to dance? Yes or no? If you're going to have a good time. How many men do you see go out dancing? Not too many. Not too many. I'm one of them. My wife, I've known her for 42 years, is still trying to teach me how to dance. I tried to tell her I have 2 left feet, which I do. Disco goes mainstream. During the summer, Van McCoy's The Hustle was the #1 hit on the Billboard Hot 100 and Hot Soul single charts. The song took disco and turned it into a cultural phenomenon with variations like the Latin hustle, the line, the New York hustles popping up on the dance floors nationally. Donna Summer, remember Donna Summer? Love to Love You, Baby? Where she's, oh, love to love you, baby, oh. My girlfriend at the time insisted I had to listen to this song. She said, listen to it, it sounds real. I said, it's a singer, it's a singer. But Love to Love You was a huge, huge, huge hit, even though some people thought it was obscene. I didn't think it was obscene. I just thought it was laughable that, it sounded like a soundtrack of an X-rated movie. I was already 19 years old, so I could see X-rated movies legally by that time. Love to Love You, Baby by Donna Summer was named by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as one of the 500 songs that shaped rock and roll. The song generated controversy due to Summer's moans and groans, and some American and European radio stations refused to play it. Bruce Springsteen, his breakout album, Born to Run, recorded in Rockland County at the 914 Studios on Route 303. The third studio album of Bruce Springsteen was Born to Run, released on August 25th, a rock and roll album. It received highly positive reviews from critics and brought Springsteen into the mainstream. Puka shell, I told you about the puka shells, right? The puka shells. Here they are in my pocket. My girlfriend at the time bought me this, made sure that I wore my puka shells. And look who else is wearing puka shells. Frank Sinatra. It was cool to wear puka shells in 1975. It's still cool today to wear puka shells in Hawaii. Hopefully those people in Maui get their island back. 'Cause Maui, I've been there 3 times. It's great. And I hope for the best for them. Lahaina and all those places, great. Anyway, Sinatra, he must have felt he was groovy wearing that. It was a necklace made of small, round, white shells worn by surfers. It caught on. It was the big fad for a brief time in 1975, and so were these for a little while. Hot pants. How many of you wore hot pants? You can admit it? Nobody wore hot pants? These are my wife's hot pants. She kept them. I don't know why, but she kept them. She was Wonder Woman, she told me. It's part of a custom that she was Wonder Woman, which was big at the time. But people went to the disco. They wore puka shells and they wore hot pants. Also, big fad was the pet rock.
Oh, yes.
The pet rock. Remember the pet rock? I had a pet screw. They came out with a pet screw after the pet rock. What did the rock do? Anything?
No.
Nothing. Sat there. But it says, this box contains one genuine pedigree pet rock. And don't open it. I had a pet screw. And I had to throw it out. The pet screw was in the cage. And the pet screw came out roughly at the same time. We kept it, but it came apart. I had a little kid at the time. My daughter was about 7 months old. It came apart. Those things were sharp, so we had to throw them out. And it must have been a long night. There is my, there is my student ID back in the day. Growing a beard. Only time I had a beard in my life. I hated beards. Hated beards. But anyway, and it says Bob. It means I could drink. But I got mononucleosis soon after that, so I stopped drinking. Mononucleosis, you can't get it by kissing. That was what it was. You got it by not eating correctly. What was that? Mononucleosis is a kissing disease. It sure is hard to shake it, but you can catch it with ease. I remember that. You remember that? Mononucleosis? Anyway, I had mononucleosis about a year after I took that picture. It's a long night. Anyway, the legacy. These things, Chuka beads are still available in Hawaii. Nobody wears hot pants anymore, but it'll come back one day. The United States and Vietnam established relations in 1995. They're trade partners. Ford was defeated by Jimmy Carter in 1976 in the presidential election. New York City would survive economically and thrive. Egypt is a strategic partner of Israel. Spain's a constitutional monarchy. Jimmy Hoffa's remains never found. Microsoft is a massive business. The Angolan Civil War ended in 2002, Cold War proxy war. Disco died by the start of the 1980s. Thatcher became England's first woman's prime minister in 1979. Squeaky Fromme, Sarah Jane Moore, both released from prison. Britain voted to leave the EU in 2016. Neither Betamax nor VHS had long lives. Puka shells, passé by 1976, and the pet rock fad ended. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments?
You're amazing.
What's amazing?